The following is a text exchange which occurred between brothers on April 21st, 2021. 1:33 p.m.
This is wild. Did you know that they routinely put animals on trial in medieval Europe?
No, but I'm not surprised, although it does seem wild.
There is a story in this book I found online about a lawyer defending rats that ate up a barley crop. He was able to delay the trial because he said a single summons was not sufficient to alert all rats to their trial date because they lived in different locations. So they read the indictment in a whole bunch of parishes. All of that is ludicrous.
Luda! Were the rats guilty?
He excused the absence of his clients for the trial due to the difficulty of the journey and because cats were waiting to eat them at every turn. It appears that Bartholomew Cesare was indeed successful.
Where's the justice for the barley crop, though?
He used the same basic argument when trying to defend a religious group called the Waldenses from accusations of heresy. He died before that case ended, though, unfortunately for the Waldenses. They were forerunners of the Protestant Reformation and suffered the fate one might expect of a Proto-Protestant group in Catholic France. The church does seem to still exist, though. About 45,000 of them worldwide.
Where? Canada?
25,000 in Italy.
I wouldn't have guessed Italy.
And 5,000 in the US. Very liberal beliefs, actually.
Wait though, how did he use the rat defense for the Waldens?
It was unsafe for them to come to trial.
Because of les chats? Nobody expects the Feline Inquisition, except for Bartholomew Cesare, of course.
I assume it was the cats they were afraid of, yes. The church is named for Peter Waldo. He was named a heretic because he read the Bible in public in a language other than Latin.
The nerve.
They have a small population in Ohio, but I can't find out where. They appear to have aligned themselves with the Methodists, though.
Was Waldo a Walden?
He was the Walden, apparently.
Good night, John Boy. Good night, Elizabeth. Good night, Daddy. Good night, son. Good night, Mary Ellen. Good night, Daddy. Good night, Mama. Good night, Mary Ellen. Good night, Jim Bob. Good night, Mama. Good night, Aaron. Good night, Jim Bob. Good night, Ben. Good night, Aaron. Good night, everybody.
I see what you did there.
Close enough. Straight from the heartland, this is Things I Text My Brother. Hey folks, and welcome back to another episode of Things I Text My Brother, a series of conversations which have taken place between the brothers Drouillard on subjects spanning the neighborhood and the globe, which will hopefully leave you smarter, kinder, and better looking. Today we're going to jump off from that dramatic reading that you just heard and discuss the topics therein. Maybe we'll talk about rats and barley. Maybe we'll talk about Waldens and Waltons. Maybe we'll talk about Ludicrous or the Feline Inquisition. But we haven't plotted an exact course because we want you to join us on that journey. That's how it works on Things I Text My Brother. I'm Jeff. This is Brad. Let's talk about our texts. But before we dive into animal trials and Waldensians, we need to take a look back. Because even though we're amongst the foremost experts on these subjects within our own households, there's always room for us to learn more and to correct our mistakes. Thus, it's time for ablutions and edification. Brother Brad, I understand you're going to get us started today with an ablution.
I do have an ablution, and I'm very excited because this is an ablution that was pointed out by one of our listeners, Skylar.
We have a listener?
We have at least two.
Hey, thanks, Skylar.
So the topic that I have my ablution on is, we mentioned it in one of our outros. I talked about stalkers in Chernobyl, and
yes.
I had read an article where they referred to a scientist, an actual scientist who was supposed to be there, going into the sarcophagus, the core of Chernobyl, and taking some levels and doing some stuff to make sure it didn't implode. And I had been tricked, it appears, into thinking that is a real term.
What?
When stalkers, in fact, come from a video game series. And there are people who now imitate this video game series and go and sneak into the reactor area in Chernobyl, and they are called stalkers. But apparently the scientists who work there are not actually called stalkers.
That makes sense. Well, I'm glad that you've corrected your past mistakes. Do you feel cleansed?
I feel cleansed. I am ready to make some new mistakes today.
That's a proper ablution. So I'm going to take us in the edification direction because we had an episode that was on, I think it was in our Drag Daughters in Rouge episode, where we were talking about Canadian football and the team known as the Montreal Alouettes. And as I was listening back to that, doing some editing, it actually occurred to me that the song Alouette exists, and it's a children's song that is pretty horrifying. And I actually knew this, but I thought our listeners should know. Do you know the song Alouette, Brad?
Alouette, jante alouette. Alouette, jante plumerai.
Oui. Apparently, that is a song that is possibly French-Canadian. We think that fur trappers and different people were singing it. It got passed down. It became a beloved children's song. But as children in the United States are learning that song, they're learning Alouette, gentille alouette, alouette, je te plumerai. You know what that means?
I do not.
It means I will pluck you. Let's sing the song in English. Lark, nice lark, lark, I will pluck you. I will pluck your head, I will pluck your head, I will pluck your beak, I will pluck your beak, and your eyes, and your eyes, and your neck, and your neck, and your wings, and your wings, and your legs, and your legs, and your tail, and your tail, and your back, and your back. Lark, I will pluck you. Isn't that horrifying? You're taunting this lark and saying, I'm going to pluck you, and you're teaching your children.
I feel like it's an appropriate song for the crypt keeper and his kids, but for most children, it's probably not pleasant. But all of those types of songs, like London Bridge and Ring Around the Rosie, they're all based on some horrible things if you get down into them.
That's true. And I guess a lot of those like German nursery rhymes are pretty terrifying as well.
Right.
Apparently, there's some thought that the Alouette song, the lark, is a morning bird. It might be the first bird to sing in the morning. Thus, it's the bird that wakes you up and breaks you from your slumber. And you might get annoyed at it. And then you would be like, lark, shut up. I'm going to pluck you. I just thought people should know. Anyway, I think the world has been edified now that they know that Alouette is all about taunting a lark that you're going to pluck his head, beak, eyes, neck, wings, legs, tail, back, and all that kind of stuff. We have been cleansed. We have been edified. I think it's time to move on. All right, Brother Brad, now that our ablutions and edification is out of the way, it's time to talk about today's subject. Where do you want to start us off?
I think I have the exact right paragraph to kick us off that will put us in the mood and the right frame of mind for the conversation we're going to have today.
Ooh, do tell.
It's from an article by Hampton L. Carson called The Trials of Animals and Insects. I'm pretty sure it pulls heavily from The Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals by E.P. Evans, which is the book I referenced in the text exchange.
Oh, okay.
That book is available free online for anyone who wants to try to read it. Mm-hmm. Much of it is in foreign languages, but it is an interesting read. So The Trials of Animals and Insects by Hampton L. Carson. Here's a passage from this article. In the open square of the old Norman city of Falaise, in the year 1386, a vast and motley crowd had gathered to witness the execution of a criminal convicted of the crime of murder. Noblemen in armor, proud dames in velvet and feathers, priests in cassock and cowl, falconers with hawks upon their wrists, huntsmen with hounds in leash. The prisoner was dressed in a new suit of man's clothes and was attended by armed men on horseback, while the hangman, before mounting the scaffold, had provided himself with new gloves and a new rope. As the prisoner had caused the death of a child by mutilating the face and arms to such an extent as to cause a fatal hemorrhage, the town tribunal had decreed that the head and legs of the prisoner should be mangled with a knife before the hanging. This was a medieval application of lex talionis, or an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. To impress a recollection of the scene upon the memories of the bystanders, an artist was employed to paint a fresco on the west wall of the transept of the Church of the Holy Trinity in Falaise, and for more than 400 years that picture could be seen and studied until destroyed in 1820 by the carelessness of a whitewasher.
What?
The criminal was not a human being, but a sow, which had indulged in the evil propensity of eating infants on the street.
A pig ate a baby?
I have to say that that's a very common occurrence. There's this friar, Humbert de Poitiers.
Mm-hmm.
He got some of his swines pardoned, but 3 of his sows were put to death because they ate a person that came into his abbey.
Yep.
And the person came in, and these 3 sows attacked and killed this person. And the judge decided that all of the pigs needed to be put to death because their snorts and sounds were encouraging the murder. So they were...
Hear, hear.
Yeah, apparently he was able to get some of his pigs off of that. There's also a story in 1864 in Slovenia where a pig ate the ears of an infant.
Yep.
Just the ears.
Yep.
So the kid lived. They killed the pig and fed it to the dogs, but they put a bond on the owner of the pig to pay for that small child, who was a girl, to pay for her dowry when she got older so she wouldn't be punished twice for the mutilation and would be able to get married.
Oh.
So I think the moral of the story is don't mess with pigs.
Yeah, and I was actually familiar with both of those stories from the research I did, but I especially liked one comment that E.P. Evans made in that Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals book from 1906, which, by the way, basically every article you will find on this subject references that book that is available on Google Books. Evans catalogs incident after incident in which pigs chewed off ears and noses and even killed children, one swine going as far as to eat a child, although it was Friday.
Why does that matter?
Can you believe he ate the child on a Friday?
What difference does that make? Because it was during Lent, and you don't eat children for Lent?
Well, Brad, would you ever eat a child on a Friday?
I can say unequivocally, unless I was a member of the Donner Party, I would not.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't eat a child on a Friday. So I went back and actually was looking at some of E.P. Evans's book, which, by the way, is like 400 pages long. I did not read the whole thing, but I did read the fact that he documented almost 200 different cases of animals being put on trial in the history of Europe in particular. Many of them were in France because the French were keeping better records of these things. But just kind of skimming through his list, and there is a list in the back of this big tome that he wrote on the subject. Looking through his list from the 9th century up through, well, even the 20th century, he listed, the first one was moles being put on trial in 9th century Italy, locusts in 9th century Rome or the countryside around Rome, serpents in 9th century France, field mice, flies, horseflies, eels, all in the Middle Ages, rats, and bloodsuckers. The bloodsuckers, what is a bloodsucker? That was in 15th century Switzerland. Caterpillars, weevils, pigs, snails in Lyon, dogs put on trial by the Parliament of Toulouse in the 16th century, and in Scotland in the 16th century, many mules, many cows, goats, turtle doves in 17th century Canada, a Russian he-goat was banished to Siberia in the 17th century, and dogs again in 18th century Italy, 1771 England, 1845 Paris. All these animals were put on trial. So it wasn't just the pigs, although clearly as we looked through, there were a lot of pigs, there were a lot of mules, there were a lot of bugs, there were a lot of weevils. Some of those repeat offenders kept coming back over and over again.
Did you ever figure out what the turtle doves in Canada actually did? I looked really hard for that because I want to know what turtle doves did. Are they like nasty like larks?
Well, maybe they just had the misfortune to sing in the morning.
Maybe. Maybe they just got into a feeding frenzy and ate the ears off a child. I don't know.
Can turtle doves come in any quantity larger than 2?
I have no idea.
I'm only familiar with 2 turtle doves.
Yeah, I know where you're going, but I can't actually say that I know the answer to that. Did you find in E.P. Evans' book, did you see in the back where they just had basically the timeline of all these things? They had a listing of all the different incidents with sources. I thought that was exciting. E.P. Evans took the time to put down the sources. So it wasn't just like Evans made this stuff up. He has real sources. These are really things that happened.
Yep, and actually that list that I just produced part of in rapid fashion was all taken from that list in his book, which I did find fascinating as well.
It seemed most of these things happened in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. But it did, like I said, that one I read was 1864 in Slovenia. So obviously that's the 19th century. So it was still happening then.
I actually saw one article which drew some sort of equivalency to what was going on with animals being put on trial, to inanimate objects being put on trial, and also witches being put on trial. So I thought that was interesting to think that a lot of times the trials seem to be less about punishing the animal as it was about some sort of outside factors. In many cases, it was the church trying to punish someone, or the state in whatever form it was taking, the city, whatever jurisdiction it was in, trying to punish people basically to prove that they were the authority, that they had the authority, more so than saying, pig, you are unjust, we will hang you.
Did you come across in your research there when you were talking about witches, did you come across the story about Cotton Mather?
No, but he was a serious, severe fellow, yes.
Yeah, you know who Cotton Mather is, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so Cotton Mather was the son of Increase Mather, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Cotton Mather was a Puritan minister, and he was basically the judge and jury. Well, mostly judge. They had a jury. He was the judge in the Salem witch trials in 1692. They did have a dog put to death for trying to bewitch a child.
Makes
so
sense.
One of the girls that was saying people were bewitching them did say this dog tried to bewitch her on the street. So that dog was killed. But Cotton Mather later declared that the dog was innocent because if it had been possessed by the devil, it wouldn't have been able to be killed. So therefore, it must have been innocent. A lot of good it did the dog. But there were actually 2 dogs that were put to death during the Salem witch trials, and a few other animals that were suggested to be possessed in that whole thing. But Cotton Mather is a fascinating character. Besides doing the Salem witch trials, he was also a leading light in Boston in 1721, so like 30 years later, during a smallpox outbreak, and he was for inoculation. So Zabdiel Boylston, which obviously is a name you'll know from living in Boston.
Yeah, Boylston Street.
Yeah, so he was a doctor, and he convinced Zabdiel that inoculation was the way to go. So they introduced inoculation, which is putting live virus on the skin, as opposed to vaccination, which is slightly different. And there was a huge thing. He was the biggest proponent, but his biggest opponent for that was Ben Franklin and James Franklin. The Franklins had the first printing press that wasn't run by the government in the Americas, and they were adamantly against anything Cotton Mather was doing because, he was Puritan, and they were against the Puritans. It's a very fascinating story, but Cotton Mather, super interesting. Named after both, Mather being his dad's name and his grandpa's name, but Cotton is his maternal grandfather's last name, so that's where he got Cotton Mather, which could make us Emke Drouillard, or even better, Boss Drouillard.
Nice.
If we wanted to go that route.
Those Puritans, they, even though they're from Massachusetts, as is Marky Mark, of course, nobody will accuse them of being the funky bunch. Although you were saying that Ben Franklin and the Mathers were kind of on different sides of things, and that makes sense because Ben Franklin, also born down there by Milk Street in Boston, he would have definitely been part of Marky Mark's funky bunch. So on one side, you got the Wahlbergs, and you've got Ben Franklin, and on the other side, you have Cotton Mather, and it all makes sense to me. That's Boston history right there.
Well, Ben Franklin eventually became a proponent of vaccinations, or inoculations as they were at the time, after his son died of a preventable disease because he didn't have him inoculated.
You were mentioning that a lot of these stories of animals going on trial were happening back in the Middle Ages, and certainly that's where the numbers lie. But I did find one that was a little bit more recent that I thought was kind of interesting, and it also ties a little bit into our enjoyment of European soccer, English soccer in particular. And that is the story of the hanging of the Hartlepool monkey. Have you heard of this?
I have not.
During the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century, there was a French ship somewhere off the shores of England near Hartlepool. But this French ship sunk, and when the English folks went out and found the ship, there was only one survivor, and it happened to have been a monkey that was said to have been dressed in a French military uniform, presumably for the enjoyment of the crew. Well, because these Hartlepoolians didn't really know what French people looked like, or so the story goes, they thought that this monkey who was wearing a French uniform must be a Frenchman and probably a French spy. Of course he is, right? The monkey wasn't able to answer any of their questions in the court, so there was no real way for the monkey to win. But the monkey was convicted, found guilty at the trial. He was dragged in the town square and hanged. That's nasty enough. It could be even worse because I've spent enough time on old ships to know that quite often the person who went and fetched the gunpowder was a young human called a powder monkey. So there are theories that this hanged individual in the French military uniform might have actually been a young French boy, a powder monkey. But either way, this person was hanged, or so the story goes. And these days, this legend has been used to taunt the people of Hartlepool. And in fact, at soccer matches today, their rivals will taunt them by chanting, "Who hung the monkey?" But the joke is on these rivals because the Hartlepoolians actually think this is a great story. And in fact, they've embraced it enough that their soccer team's mascot is called Hangus the Monkey. And one of their mayoral candidates actually dressed up as Hangus the Monkey in his mayoral electoral bid and won several re-elections after the fact. Whether it's true or not that this French ship went down and a monkey was the only survivor, there is this embraced tale in Hartlepool. The hanging of the Hartlepool monkey is kind of a big deal.
Is there an equivalent to that kind of story in American sports? I was trying to think while you're talking about it. Where there is named after something ridiculous like that.
Oh, I'm sure there is, but I can't think of any offhand.
I can't come up with them. But I do know that Nellie Bly...
Yes.
You know Nellie Bly, yes?
Yes.
Nellie Bly on her race around the world to try to beat the Around the World in 80 Days.
Mm-hmm.
At one point on the return trip home, she was on a boat and they were having a rough passing. She had found herself a monkey at some point in one of her stops. And it apparently was a mean-spirited monkey. Not nice to anybody, especially to Nellie Bly. They decided the monkey was the cause of their bad weather and bad travel. So they sacrificed the monkey.
Jeez.
It didn't actually change the weather, but they gave it a shot.
Well, Nellie Bly is one worth looking into if people aren't familiar with her. Her act of getting committed to uncover the bad treatment within the women's asylums in New York City, she did some impressive stuff. But I want to take us back to the original text exchange. We talked about the Waldenses, and we haven't really addressed it since. So what do you have to say about them? Or the Waldensians, I guess they're called sometimes.
The Waldenses, yes. And now I've lost my train of thought. But the Waldens, named for Peter Waldo, who might actually have been named Peter Valdes and apparently translated to Waldo at some point. They were one of the first Proto-Protestant groups. They were formed in 1160, and they still exist today, which I find amazing. So they survived through persecution. I read somewhere, I don't know if this is true, of religious groups. They were like the third most prosecuted by the Catholic Church over history, if you add all the prosecution in that they had from 1160 to whenever they stopped trying to kill them. They were founded in 1160, believed in being able to give access to the Bible to people who didn't speak Latin. So they trained a bunch of young kids to memorize the Bible and take that out with them into the world. They sent them to colleges and universities around Europe with this knowledge of the Bible, in their minds, but also sewed into their clothing, and so they could hand out things that people could read and access the Bible in a different way. So they were kind of doing some of the things that Luther wanted to do. Before Luther wanted to do them, and they kind of survived to this day. I couldn't find where they were in Ohio. I saw something in passing that maybe it was Miami County in the southwest of Ohio. Maybe there. I did find there's a bunch of them in Utah that went there, and they kind of became Mormon Waldens. In Italy, they joined with the Methodists and became the Evangelical Methodists. I don't know if they're different than regular Methodists, but Evangelical Methodists to become Methodist Waldenses. And so they became Presbyterian Waldenses in this big enclave they had in North Carolina, which was the largest collection of Waldenses outside of Italy. So they kind of evolved to survive, but not really ever getting rid of their core beliefs. My favorite part of it, though, is the leader of the church in North Carolina. His name was Reverend Charles Elbert Tron.
Tron. How did the Waldenses tie into this story of the animals? Chesney used, what, you said a similar defense for them that he used for the rats, and it seems like the defense for the rats was, how are you going to give a summons to all these rats when they live in all these different places, or something like that?
Not that part. It was the fear part. When he defended the rats, Chesney said that the rats couldn't come and defend themselves, that they couldn't have a fair trial because of the unwearied vigilance of their mortal enemies, the cats. Oh. Everywhere they would go, cats were out to get them, and they would be killed. So because they were too afraid to come to trial, they couldn't really be tried. And so he basically used the same logic 20 some odd years later with the Waldenses, saying basically that they can't come to trial because if they come out of hiding, they'll be persecuted and killed. That's unfair. And he died before he got to see that trial through, and they just ignored everything he said and kept persecuting them, even though they didn't come to trial.
Because I was reading that there were other cases in which it was determined that you couldn't really, especially in the cases of insects and vermin, you couldn't reasonably get them all notified of the charges against them. So it was hard to bring them to trials. And in many cases, with the pigs and the animals that were owned by individuals, they were criminal trials. But in the case of things like the bugs and the locusts and the vermin and things like that weren't owned by people, they became church trials or ecclesiastical trials, and the accused weren't in danger of being put to death. They were in danger of being excommunicated from the church.
I read that too.
I love the thought of a weevil or a mole getting excommunicated from the church. I'm not sure how that little vermin would recover from such a terrible fate.
It is a terrible fate. I was able to find that the turtle doves in Canada were excommunicated.
Oh, no.
I don't know what they did in the 17th century, these turtle doves, but I do know that they were excommunicated for their crimes. Now, there was one story I read about a rooster in Basel, Switzerland, who was tried for laying an egg. And since it was abhorrent and unusual for a rooster to lay an egg, they just put it to death so it wouldn't create the Antichrist through this egg that it was laying.
Wait, why was the rooster laying an evil egg?
I don't know. I couldn't find anything other than a passing mention of it, so I don't know what actually happened there.
Did this rooster just look at somebody wrong or something?
I don't know. They said it laid an egg, and roosters shouldn't lay eggs, so anything that was born out of that egg could not be good.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's bigotry at its best, I guess. Here's a question for you. I found an article on CBS News, and they listed the top 20 deadliest animals ranked by numbers of deaths they caused in the year 2018. What do you think was the number one member of the animal kingdom in killing people?
I would actually maybe go against conventional wisdom in terms of picking the most dangerous animal and think it would probably be something that we have the most contact with. I would say dogs.
It's mosquitoes.
Oh, that makes sense. Yes.
They were the cause of 830,000 deaths in like 2017 because this article was written in 2018. Number two was humans with 500 and some odd, 580,000. Then snakes, because snakes. Then it was the sandfly,
Oh.
which causes a disease that kills people. Then dogs. So dogs were number five at 17,400, but not anywhere near mosquitoes and humans.
And are they counting unintentional deaths like car crashes as human on human deaths?
I don't think they were. They were called murder, actual killings. Actual killings. So not murder because war's not murder.
Yeah.
Actual killings. Then number 6 was the kissing bug causing Chagas disease. Then number 7, I only wanted to go this far because I was fascinated by this and I had to look it up. Number 7 was freshwater snails.
Yeah. Well,
So freshwater snails pass parasites that then kill you.
yeah, I don't want anything to do with snails.
I would like it to be noted, though, and put on the record here, for whatever record this is, that we have a whole week on television here in the United States celebrating the murderous shark, and they only killed 6 people in the year that this was recorded on.
They need to step it up.
I don't know, go back to talking about dogs and snakes. You can't badmouth snakes enough. Snakes are scary. I don't like them.
Well, Brother Brad, there's one man who may or may not be afraid of snakes, who may or may not have experienced the Feline Inquisition. But he is our Father Art, and he is ludicrous, and we are going to ask him some questions.
If you were going to put a type of animal on trial, which would you choose and why?
Probably a monkey because it would be the most entertaining.
Do you have any guess as to what the Waldenses were?
No.
The Waldenses were a religious sect
In
in France. Oh, so you do know?
Well,
You lied to me.
I just looked it up when,
So?
when you mentioned it. I know it's a religious sect, but I don't know of what flavor.
Well, they were an offshoot of Catholicism because they came before Martin Luther. But they had some of the same beliefs that Martin Luther did from the Genesis. But they're still around.
Yeah,
I have some in Ohio, which
I know a fair amount about religious sects, but I have to admit I've never heard of the Waldenses.
What is the appropriate sentence for a rat found guilty of eating a barley crop?
Probably a life sentence and sentence him to life in a rice field.
I like that. What percentage of families do you think say good night to each other individually at a common bedtime, as the Waltons did?
I'd say that's a very small number now. Maybe more in the 30s and 40s. I can't imagine anybody doing it now except as a joke.
Do you regret not doing so when you had children before your schedule didn't permit it?
Yes.
Well, folks, now that we've heard from Father Art, it means that our time together is coming to an end for this episode. We said just about everything we can say about murderous pigs, Puritans called cotton, hypervigilant cats, excommunication, lark plucking, and Hangus the Monkey. But fear not, we'll have another episode coming your way soon, just as soon as we can dig back into the archives and find another gem of a text exchange and do just enough research that we can pretend like we know what we're talking about. In the meantime, you can head over to our Instagram page at Things I Text My Brother Podcast to drop us a note about what you liked, what you didn't like, or to tell us about something that we got totally wrong. We might even have enough time to tell a friend, an enemy, and a total stranger to give us a listen. If you manage to do any of that, the fraternity of Drouillards will be forever grateful. But most importantly, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. some glad morning when this life is over, I'll fly away.
If you say so.
I'll fly away, oh glory, I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away.
Of course it's Pete. Look at him.
Pete's a toad.
That's a good boy.
Just a few more weary days and then I'll fly away to a land where joy shall never end. I'll fly away. I'll fly away, oh glory, I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away.
Où est le piscine? Splish splash.
Là-bas.
Oh, Gérard Depardieu.